I had been planning this camping trip for months. It wasn't some fancy adventure with guided tours or prepared trails. It was pure isolation. Just me, my backpack, and the woods. I wanted it that way. I wanted to get far away from everything, from people, from noise, from responsibilities. My plan was simple. I would hike deep into the national forest, find a remote clearing near a creek, set up camp, and spend a few nights alone. I had done shorter trips before, but nothing as intense as this. The forest I chose was known for being untouched, dense, and wild. It was a place people went in groups, rarely alone. But I wanted to test myself. I started my hike early in the morning, when the sun was just brushing the tips of the trees with golden light. The air was crisp, and there was a faint smell of wet earth from the night before. I carried a large backpack with a tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, and enough food for 3 days. I also had a first aid kit, a flashlight, a map, and a compass. Everything was packed meticulously. I had double-checked everything the night before. The first few hours were easy. The path was narrow, overgrown in places, but still visible. Birds called from the treetops, and I could hear the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Occasionally, a deer would bolt out from the trees, disappearing before I could even get a good look. By midday, the sun was high and hot, and I realized I had underestimated the difficulty of carrying such a heavy pack over uneven terrain. My shoulders ached, my back throbbed, and the soles of my boots were already scuffed from rocks and roots. I stopped by a stream to rest and drink. The water was icy cold, and I filled my bottle carefully, filtering it with my portable system. As I sat on a fallen log, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten slightly. The forest around me was unnervingly quiet. Not the calm quiet of a peaceful forest, but the heavy, tense quiet that comes when something is watching. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was nothing, that animals were smart enough to hide from humans. I drank my water and moved on. I planned to hike until I found a suitable clearing, but as the afternoon dragged on, I realized the forest was denser than I had anticipated. Every clearing seemed too small, too uneven, or too close to steep ravines. By the time the sun started to drop, I was tired, sweaty, and still deep in the woods. I knew I needed to find a spot soon. Night in the forest is unpredictable. The temperature drops quickly, and moving in the dark without a clear path can be dangerous. I spotted a small flat area near a creek, with enough space for my tent. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. Setting up the tent took longer than usual. My hands were shaking from exhaustion, and my fingers were numb from the cold water of the creek I had used to wash off. I hammered the stakes into the rocky soil, making sure everything was secure. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest shifted. Shadows stretched long and deep, and the air became thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. I built a small fire, enough to give me warmth and a bit of light, but nothing too large that it would attract unwanted attention. I ate a simple meal of canned beans and bread, washed down with water, and tried to relax. My body ached, but my mind refused to settle. There was something in the way the forest seemed to close in on me, the way every crack of a branch made me jump. I told myself it was just the wilderness being alive. Night came fully, and I crawled into my sleeping bag. I tried to sleep, but the sounds of the forest were louder at night than I expected. I could hear something moving near the creek. A splash, a rustle, the crunch of leaves. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or deer, but then the sound grew closer. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, peering into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the trees and the moving shadows of branches in the firelight. I shook my head and crawled back inside. Sleep was impossible. Every noise, every movement made me tense. I felt like I was being watched, but I kept telling myself it was my imagination. I was alone in the forest, and the forest was full of animals. Around midnight, I finally heard it. A crunch, louder than anything before, moving deliberately toward me. It wasn't random like the wind or an animal. It was deliberate. My stomach dropped. I stayed as still as I could, trying to listen. Came closer, then paused. I could hear breathing, Human breathing. My first instinct was disbelief. No one was supposed to be here. I hadn't seen another person for hours. I had cell service on my phone, but only one bar. I debated calling, but thought it might make things worse if there really was someone dangerous. I slowly reached for my small knife, the only weapon I had, and waited. The breathing was heavy, slow, deliberate. It moved past my tent, close enough that I could hear the subtle sound of clothing brushing against leaves. My mind raced. Should I hide? Should I confront? Should I stay completely silent and hope it passed? I had no plan. After what felt like hours, the breathing moved away, receding into the darkness. I stayed frozen for a long time, listening. Then, nothing. Silence. The forest seemed calm again. Exhausted, I forced myself to sleep, but it was fitful. Every shadow made me flinch. Every noise made me sit up. Morning came with the sound of birds and sunlight filtering through the trees. I had survived the night, but I felt shaken. I decided to stay cautious. I packed a lighter, some rocks, and my knife into my jacket pockets, keeping my backpack light for the hike back if necessary. I tried to convince myself that it was just a hunter or another camper, but the deliberate sound of that breathing stuck in my mind. Whoever it was had known I was there. They had passed close enough to see me, and yet had not spoken or revealed themselves. That scared me more than anything. People who hunt quietly in these woods usually do not intend to harm, but silence so deliberate felt deliberate for a reason. I spent the next several hours reinforcing the cabin's security. Windows were checked, doors locked, additional furniture pushed against entry points. I gathered more wood for the stove and kept it burning constantly, its warmth a small comfort against the creeping fear. The forest, once serene in my imagination, now felt alive with hidden eyes, every sound magnified. I didn't dare venture far. I stayed close to the cabin, patrolling its perimeter when light allowed, trying to convince myself I was safe. By the second night, the fear had become almost tangible. I could hear more than the usual forest sounds, branches snapping closer than they should, occasional low thumps against the cabin walls. The dragging sound had returned, slower now, deliberate, testing my resolve. I did not leave the cabin after sunset, using the flashlight sparingly. My fire burned continuously, smoke curling up into the night, a signal of my presence to anyone or anything outside. I slept fitfully, catching short moments of rest when the noise subsided, only to wake immediately when it resumed. Morning brought partial relief, but the footprints remained, circling closer to the cabin each night. I realized whoever had been there was not a random traveler. They were methodical, aware of my presence, possibly watching from a distance. The tension was exhausting. I rationed my food and water, keeping essentials close to me. I did not make noise, did not leave the cabin unnecessarily, and avoided eye contact with any shadows that moved in the trees. On the third night, the tension reached its peak. I had been awake most of the evening, scanning the forest, waiting. At some point, the dragging sound was replaced by a different noise. Deliberate knocks against the wooden walls. I could feel them more than hear them, reverberating through the cabin. The pattern was irregular, testing my nerves, reminding me of my isolation. I clutched a heavy log, ready to defend myself if necessary. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run, but leaving meant crossing the forest alone in darkness, exactly what whoever or whatever was outside would want. Then, just before dawn, I saw movement through a narrow gap in the window blinds. A figure, crouched, moving silently among the trees. Not a shadow, not an animal, but a person. They were observing just beyond the edge of visibility. My heart pounded so violently it felt like it would burst from my chest. I realized I had only one option. I had to leave before being trapped. I waited for the light to rise enough to give me a visual path. When it did, I gathered my things, packed the essentials, and moved as quietly as possible to the side of the cabin facing the road. I had scouted the route during the day, noting the least dense patches of trees. With every step, I felt eyes on me, breathless anticipation, but I didn't stop. The forest seemed endless, the shadows deep, but I kept moving, using memory and instinct to navigate. After what felt like hours, I broke through the tree line and onto the gravel road. Relief washed over me like a flood. I ran toward the nearest highway, waving down the first passing car, barely able to speak as I explained my situation. The driver called the authorities while I sat trembling in the passenger seat, my backpack clutched tightly. Later, the police came, combing the area. Footprints confirmed I had not imagined anything. The cabin had been approached repeatedly, someone trying to test its defenses, watching, waiting. They assured me that the perpetrator likely retreated when I left, though they never caught anyone. I returned home shaken but alive, with a clear memory of the terror and a newfound understanding of how vulnerable isolation could make a person. From that experience, I learned to respect the woods, to never underestimate the presence of others, and to always be aware of my surroundings. The fear stayed with me for months, a quiet reminder every time I drove down a remote road or noticed a shadow that lingered too long. I never went back to that cabin, and I made sure to always let someone know exactly where I was going whenever I ventured into remote areas. The lesson was hard, but it was clear. Survival sometimes depended not on strength, but on awareness, caution, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. I had always been drawn to the idea of camping alone, away from the hum of the city, the constant buzz of phones, and the pressure of everyday life. I liked the idea of silence, of being able to wake up and see nothing but trees and sky for miles. It wasn't a decision I took lightly. I had spent weeks planning, reading maps, checking weather reports, and buying gear. I wanted to make sure that I was as prepared as I could be. I told myself I would choose a place far from the popular trails, a place where I could truly be alone. That was how I ended up in a small forest reserve several hours away from the nearest town. The drive there was long, and the last hour was along a narrow, winding dirt road that shook my car with every dip and rock. By the time I arrived at the parking area, the sun was low in the sky, bleeding orange and red across the horizon. I pulled my pack from the back of the car, checked that I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, food, extra batteries, first aid kit, and started the short hike toward the area I had marked on the map. The trail was narrow and overgrown in parts, which was exactly what I had hoped for. Few people came here. That evening, I walked carefully, scanning the ground for roots and rocks, listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional distant call of a bird or rustle of small animals. The forest smelled damp and earthy, a mixture of pine and wet soil, the smell thick and heavy in the evening air. After about 45 minutes, I found a clearing I had noted on the map. It wasn't large, but it had flat ground, a few rocks for sitting, and a small creek running nearby. It was perfect. I set my pack down and began to unpack, laying out my sleeping bag and starting the tent. The sun had dipped behind the trees by the time I finished, and the forest had grown darker than I had expected. The sky above was a deepening blue, the first stars beginning to appear. I lit my small camping stove and boiled water for dinner. The smell of hot noodles and the faint hiss of boiling water made me feel alive and alone in a way that I had been craving. I ate slowly, listening to the sounds around me. The forest was alive, but not noisy. Birds had mostly quieted for the night, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional snap of a branch. I cleaned up my dishes and placed everything back in my backpack, making sure it was tightly sealed. Bears weren't common in this area, but I knew raccoons and other small animals could be curious. I checked my flashlight, made sure my knife was within reach, and climbed into my sleeping bag. The night was calm, but I couldn't sleep immediately. The darkness pressed in around me. I could see the shapes of trees against the sky, shadowy and massive, and I felt small and exposed. Around midnight, I heard something unusual. At first, it was faint, a soft crunching sound somewhere beyond the creek. My heart jumped. I froze, listening carefully. The sound came again, closer this time, like someone walking slowly over fallen branches. My mind tried to rationalize it, maybe a deer or a fox, but there was a rhythm to it, a deliberate pace that didn't sound like an animal. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and pointed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating a patch of the forest floor, but there was nothing there. The sound stopped. I waited, straining to hear, every nerve alert. I lay back down, telling myself it was probably nothing, but sleep wouldn't come. The forest had shifted in the dark. Every small noise, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, made me tense. Around 2 a.m., the sound returned. This time it was closer, unmistakably deliberate, coming from around the edge of the clearing. I could hear the faint echo of footsteps, slow and careful, moving through the dry leaves. My stomach sank. I was alone, no one for miles. The reality of my situation hit me with a wave of fear I hadn't felt before. I reached for my knife again, and I considered leaving the tent to confront whoever it might be, but I didn't want to reveal myself. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped abruptly near the edge of my tent. My flashlight flicked on, off, in my mind, but I dared not move. I told myself that whoever it was might just leave. I had no choice but to wait. Hours passed. Dawn began to seep through the trees slowly, washing the clearing in pale gray light. The footsteps had stopped, and whatever had been moving in the darkness was gone. I crawled out of the tent, stiff from lying in tension all night, and scanned the area. Nothing seemed disturbed. The tent was intact, my pack untouched, but something felt off. I noticed footprints in the soft mud near the creek. They were human. Someone had been here. They had walked slowly around my clearing, maybe even watched me through the night. I felt my chest tighten. I had never imagined someone could be so close, unseen, in the dead of night. I packed quickly, my hands shaking, and began the hike back to my car. Every sound made me jump. The snapping of branches under my own feet, the rustle of squirrels, the call of birds. I kept my knife ready, my backpack tight against my body. I tried to move quickly, but carefully, scanning the forest constantly. The path back felt longer than the way in. Every turn, every shadow seemed to conceal something. I remembered the map I had studied for hours, and I focused on it, trying to follow the landmarks I had memorized. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the dirt road, and relief washed over me. I kept walking until I saw my car, headlights reflecting off the rearview mirror. I unlocked it and got in, locking the doors immediately. I sat there for a moment, shaking, listening to the forest behind me. I checked my phone. No service. I didn't care. I started the car and drove back along the winding dirt road, keeping my eyes peeled for any signs of someone following. When I finally reached the main highway, I felt almost as if I could breathe normally again. The experience stayed with me for weeks. I couldn't shake the image of those footprints, the feeling of being watched, the sound of deliberate footsteps in the night. I realized that being alone in the forest carried real danger, and not from animals or supernatural forces, but from other people. That realization changed the way I approached camping. I still loved the wilderness, still needed that silence, but I never camped alone again. I learned to trust my instincts, to watch, to prepare for the unexpected. And most importantly, I learned that fear wasn't always in the dark. Sometimes it was in the knowledge that someone else could be out there, invisible and patient, waiting for a moment. From then on, I always told someone exactly where I would be, kept my phone fully charged, and never underestimated the vulnerability of being alone. The forest was beautiful, still my escape, but now I knew that beauty was paired with caution. Every sound, every shadow, every rustle could carry meaning, and that knowledge, though it didn't ruin the peace of the woods, made me infinitely more aware and alive every time I stepped among the trees. I had been planning this camping trip for months, marking trails, reading maps, checking weather reports, and making lists of everything I needed. I wanted to escape, to be deep in the forest, far from roads, cars, and people, and just survive on my own skills for a few days. I had done smaller trips before, but this one was supposed to be more challenging, further away from any trailheads, deeper into the backcountry. My backpack was heavy, filled with a tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, a water filter, first aid, and extra clothes. I had my knife strapped to my belt, a small hatchet in my pack, and a map and compass in my pocket. My phone had a small signal at the trailhead, but I knew it would die quickly once I went deeper, so I didn't rely on it at all. The first day went as planned. I drove to the small lot where the trail started, parked, checked my gear, and started hiking. The trail wound through thick forest, with tall pine trees and patches of moss covering the ground. Sunlight streamed through the leaves in golden rays, and the smell of pine and earth made me feel alive. I was alone, and it felt good. Every few hours, I paused to drink water, eat a small snack, and check my map. I kept my pace steady, careful not to tire myself out too early, and made sure to note landmarks, such as unusual trees, rock formations, or fallen logs, so I could find my way back. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing next to a slow-moving stream. It wasn't a campsite, but it was level and dry enough to pitch my tent. I worked quickly, hammering in stakes, setting up the rain fly, and organizing my pack inside. Then I boiled water over my small stove and cooked dinner. The forest was quiet except for the sound of water, the wind rustling the trees, and occasional birdsong. I went to sleep feeling content and secure. My sleeping bag was warm, and I had everything I needed. But when I woke in the middle of the night, I realized the forest was not as quiet as it had seemed. There was a noise outside the tent, soft at first, like something moving carefully over dry leaves. I froze, my heart thumping. It wasn't unusual for small animals to be out at night, but the sound felt deliberate, close, and slow. I reached for my flashlight, shone it outside, but all I saw was darkness and the dim outline of trees. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably a deer or raccoon, maybe a fox. I knew that many animals avoided humans, and most were harmless. I told myself to relax, went back to sleep, but my mind stayed alert. Every little crack of a branch or rustle made me sit up, scanning the shadows. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I slept again. The next morning, I packed up quickly, feeling an unease I couldn't shake. I hiked along the trail, keeping my eyes open for anything unusual. The forest was beautiful, the sunlight breaking through the canopy, illuminating ferns and mossy rocks. I stopped for water, checking my map, and kept moving. By afternoon, I reached a spot where the trail forked. I had planned to follow the right path, which was supposed to lead to a higher ridge and a small lake I wanted to see. I checked my compass and map carefully and started up the right trail. It was narrower, overgrown, and less maintained. That made me uneasy because I knew the backcountry trails could be confusing, and getting lost was a real risk. Still, I pressed on, telling myself to stay calm and follow the markers. By late afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen a marker in over an hour. The trail became faint, overgrown, and full of obstacles. I checked my compass, and I was still heading generally in the right direction, but the terrain was steeper than expected. I climbed over fallen trees, ducked under low branches, and navigated around thick bushes. Then I heard a noise, a low, heavy footstep behind me, not animal-like but deliberate. I froze. I listened. There was silence for a moment, then the sound again, slow, careful, and deliberate. My stomach tightened. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a hiker, a hunter, or even a ranger checking the trails, but the area was remote. There should not be anyone else. My heart was pounding, and I realized I had been looking over my shoulder without noticing it. I moved faster, trying to put distance between myself and whatever was behind me, but the terrain made it hard. As the sun started to lower, I realized I would not make it to the lake before dark. I looked around desperately for a safe place to camp. There was a small clearing about 50 meters off the trail, surrounded by trees, with some flat ground. I walked there carefully, choosing a spot where I could see anyone coming, but I also knew that in a dense forest, visibility was limited. I pitched my tent quickly, throwing in my gear, and made sure my knife and hatchet were close. I boiled water, ate a small meal, and tried to calm myself. The footsteps had stopped, but my nerves were raw. I kept scanning the dark forest, listening for anything unusual. The wind picked up, and the trees creaked. Every shadow looked like a person, every crack of a branch like a footstep. Night fell and I stayed alert. I kept my flashlight and my hatchet ready, lying in the sleeping bag with my pack in front of me. Around midnight, I heard it again. A branch snapping, very deliberate, very close. I froze, my ears straining. The sound moved around the clearing, circling my tent. I whispered to myself that it must be an animal, but it was too heavy, too careful. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a bear? But the steps were too measured, not like a bear moving quickly or clumsily. Could it be a person? My stomach dropped. I realized I was completely alone, in a forest where no one should be at this hour, and someone or something was watching me. I stayed awake, trying to make as little noise as possible, thinking about what to do. I considered leaving the tent, but that would be foolish. I had no idea who or what was out there, and walking into the darkness would make me a sitting target. I tried to stay calm, kept checking my knife and hatchet, and listened. Hours passed, each second stretching endlessly. Eventually, the forest became quiet, or at least I convinced myself it had. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, exhausted but alive. When morning came, I cautiously unzipped the tent and looked around. The clearing was empty. Nothing was there. No footprints, no disturbance, just leaves and pine needles. I packed up quickly, deciding to abandon the trail I had planned and head back the way I came. I moved cautiously but swiftly, keeping my eyes on the trail, watching every shadow, listening to every sound. It took hours, but eventually, I reached a familiar marker and then the main trail. Relief flooded me as I realized I knew where I was. I didn't run, but I walked quickly, not daring to look around too much. When I finally reached the trailhead, I saw my car. I locked it, got inside, and started the engine. The moment I was on the road, the tension in my body released. I drove slowly, still on edge, but heading toward civilization, people, and safety. I stopped at a small store to rest, eat, and call my family. I told them I was okay, though I didn't mention everything. I didn't want anyone to worry excessively, but I also knew I had experienced something dangerous that night. I had been lucky. The reality was clear. Being alone in the backcountry at night, unprepared for someone, or something, watching, could have ended badly. After that trip, I adjusted how I prepared for camping. I brought more than one way to signal for help. I stayed on maintained trails, and I became much more cautious about camping alone in isolated areas. I also carried pepper spray, extra lights, and always made sure someone knew my exact location and plans. That trip taught me the value of preparation, awareness, and respect for the wilderness. Not just for the animals and weather, but for other people who could be dangerous. Looking back, I understand that fear is a survival tool. My mind noticed every small sound, every shadow, and every movement because my life depended on it, even if it wasn't certain what the threat was. I survived that night by staying calm, being alert, and trusting my instincts. It wasn't an adventure anymore. It was a lesson, one I never forgot. Even now, years later, when I walk in the forest alone, I am aware of every sound, every movement, every shadow. The forest is beautiful, and solitude is peaceful, but I never forget that a moment of carelessness can turn calm into danger instantly. And that first night taught me to respect the unknown and to always be prepared for the worst, no matter how small the chance may seem. I reached for my knife again, and I considered leaving the tent to confront whoever it might be, but I didn't want to reveal myself. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped abruptly near the edge of my tent. My flashlight flicked on, off, in my mind, but I dared not move. I told myself that whoever it was might just leave. I had no choice but to wait. Hours passed. Dawn began to seep through the trees slowly, washing the clearing in pale gray light. The footsteps had stopped, and whatever had been moving in the darkness was gone. I crawled out of the tent, stiff from lying in tension all night, and scanned the area. Nothing seemed disturbed. The tent was intact, my pack untouched. but something felt off. I noticed footprints in the soft mud near the creek. They were human. Someone had been here. They had walked slowly around my clearing, maybe even watched me through the night. I felt my chest tighten. I had never imagined someone could be so close, unseen, in the dead of night. I packed quickly, my hands shaking, and began the hike back to my car. Every sound made me jump. The snapping of branches under my own feet, the rustle of squirrels, the call of birds. I kept my knife ready, my backpack tight against my body. I tried to move quickly, but carefully, scanning the forest constantly. The path back felt longer than the way in. Every turn, every shadow seemed to conceal something. I remembered the map I had studied for hours, and I focused on it, trying to follow the landmarks I had memorized. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the dirt road, and relief washed over me. I kept walking until I saw my car, headlights reflecting off the rearview mirror. I unlocked it and got in, locking the doors immediately. I sat there for a moment, shaking, listening to the forest behind me. I checked my phone. No service. I didn't care. I started the car and drove back along the winding dirt road, keeping my eyes peeled for any signs of someone following. When I finally reached the main highway, I felt almost as if I could breathe normally again. The experience stayed with me for weeks. I couldn't shake the image of those footprints, the feeling of being watched, the sound of deliberate footsteps in the night. I realized that being alone in the forest carried real danger, and not from animals or supernatural forces, but from other people. That realization changed the way I approached camping. I still loved the wilderness, still needed that silence, but I never camped alone again. I learned to trust my instincts, to watch, to prepare for the unexpected. And most importantly, I learned that fear wasn't always in the dark. Sometimes it was in the knowledge that someone else could be out there, invisible and patient, waiting for a moment. From then on, I always told someone exactly where I would be, kept my phone fully charged, and never underestimated the vulnerability of being alone. The forest was beautiful, still my escape, but now I knew that beauty was paired with caution. Every sound, every shadow, every rustle could carry meaning, and that knowledge, though it didn't ruin the peace of the woods, made me infinitely more aware and alive every time I stepped among the trees. I had always been drawn to the idea of camping alone, away from the hum of the city, the constant buzz of phones, and the pressure of everyday life. I liked the idea of silence, of being able to wake up and see nothing but trees and sky for miles. It wasn't a decision I took lightly. I had spent weeks planning, reading maps, checking weather reports, and buying gear. I wanted to make sure that I was as prepared as I could be. I told myself I would choose a place far from the popular trails, a place where I could truly be alone. That was how I ended up in a small forest reserve several hours away from the nearest town. The drive there was long, and the last hour was along a narrow, winding dirt road that shook my car with every dip and rock. By the time I arrived at the parking area, the sun was low in the sky, bleeding orange and red across the horizon. I pulled my pack from the back of the car, checked that I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, food, extra batteries, first aid kit, and started the short hike toward the area I had marked on the map. The trail was narrow and overgrown in parts, which was exactly what I had hoped for. Few people came here. That evening, I walked carefully, scanning the ground for roots and rocks, listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional distant call of a bird or rustle of small animals. The forest smelled damp and earthy, a mixture of pine and wet soil, the smell thick and heavy in the evening air. After about 45 minutes, I found a clearing I had noted on the map. It wasn't large, but it had flat ground, a few rocks for sitting, and a small creek running nearby. It was perfect. I set my pack down and began to unpack, laying out my sleeping bag and starting the tent. The sun had dipped behind the trees by the time I finished, and the forest had grown darker than I had expected. The sky above was a deepening blue, the first stars beginning to appear. I lit my small camping stove and boiled water for dinner. The smell of hot noodles and the faint hiss of boiling water made me feel alive and alone in a way that I had been craving. I ate slowly, listening to the sounds around me. The forest was alive, but not noisy. Birds had mostly quieted for the night, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional snap of a branch. I cleaned up my dishes and placed everything back in my backpack, making sure it was tightly sealed. Bears weren't common in this area, but I knew raccoons and other small animals could be curious. I checked my flashlight, made sure my knife was within reach, and climbed into my sleeping bag. The night was calm, but I couldn't sleep immediately. The darkness pressed in around me. I could see the shapes of trees against the sky, shadowy and massive, and I felt small and exposed. Around midnight, I heard something unusual. At first, it was faint, a soft crunching sound somewhere beyond the creek. My heart jumped. I froze, listening carefully. The sound came again, closer this time, like someone walking slowly over fallen branches. My mind tried to rationalize it, maybe a deer or a fox, but there was a rhythm to it, a deliberate pace that didn't sound like an animal. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and pointed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating a patch of the forest floor, but there was nothing there. The sound stopped. I waited, straining to hear, every nerve alert. I lay back down, telling myself it was probably nothing, but sleep wouldn't come. The forest had shifted in the dark. Every small noise, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, made me tense. Around 2 a.m., the sound returned. This time it was closer, unmistakably deliberate, coming from around the edge of the clearing. I could hear the faint echo of footsteps, slow and careful, moving through the dry leaves. My stomach sank. I was alone, no one for miles. The reality of my situation hit me with a wave of fear I hadn't felt before. I had been planning this camping trip for months. It was early October, and the forest near Black Pine Ridge was supposed to be at its most beautiful. The leaves were turning shades of amber, crimson, and gold, and I wanted to get away from the noise of the city before winter closed in. I had done plenty of day hikes and a few short overnight trips, but this was my first extended solo camping trip, and I wanted to push myself to handle the solitude, to be completely on my own for several days. I thought I was prepared. I thought I knew what I was getting into. I had a new tent, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, a stove, enough food for 4 days, a map, compass, and a fully charged GPS device. I had even brought a small first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a heavy-duty knife. I carried all of it in a large backpack that weighed more than I liked, but I wanted to be ready. I arrived at the trailhead late in the morning, the sun high enough to cast strong shadows across the forest floor. The air smelled crisp and earthy. It was the smell I loved most about autumn camping. The mix of dry leaves, damp soil, pine, and smoke from distant fireplaces in small cabins tucked along the roads. I slung my backpack on and started down the main trail, the soft crunch of fallen leaves under my boots keeping me company. The first few hours were easy. The trail wound through dense pine stands and open meadows, and the sun filtered through the branches in streaks that made everything look golden. Birds called to one another from high branches, and I paused occasionally to take pictures of unusual fungi or twisted trees with bark that looked like it had been carved by some invisible sculptor. The further I went, the fewer people I saw. By mid-afternoon, I hadn't seen another hiker for hours, and the trail began to narrow, winding into thicker forest. I had planned to camp near a small lake marked on the map, about 5 miles in. The thought of setting up near water made me excited. I wanted to hear the quiet lapping of waves at night, the occasional splash of fish, and the wind moving over the surface. I found the lake just as the sun began to tilt toward the horizon, giving the forest an orange glow. It was more beautiful than I had imagined. Small, secluded, with a rocky shoreline and dense trees hugging its edge. I dropped my backpack and took a long moment to just breathe, taking in the stillness. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground a little away from the water's edge, careful to avoid low areas where water might collect in case of rain. I staked it down firmly, then gathered firewood from the surrounding forest. I had a small, compact stove for cooking, but I wanted a fire for warmth and comfort. As I worked, I noticed how silent the forest was. It wasn't the complete silence of a city without people, but it was alive in its own way. The occasional rustle of leaves, the distant cracking of branches, and the soft gurgle of the lake were the only sounds. The wind was light, brushing against the needles of the pines and the tops of the oaks. I cooked a simple dinner, instant rice mixed with dehydrated vegetables and a little canned chicken, eating slowly while watching the sky turn deep blue. Stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was thick with them. I had always loved camping for this reason. The way the sky felt endless, the way the forest at night felt both protective and mysterious. But as I finished eating, I noticed something unusual. A low, rhythmic cracking came from deeper in the trees. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the forest was mostly still, and the sound was too deliberate. It was faint, but steady, like someone was walking through the forest, stepping on twigs. I froze. The sound came from the northwest, deeper into the forest. For a moment, I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe, or some other forest creature. But the pattern of the steps didn't match what I knew of deer movements. These were heavy, deliberate, almost careful. My heart rate quickened, but I reminded myself I was equipped for emergencies. I double-checked my knife, making sure it was within reach, and turned on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. I waited, straining to hear any other noise, and then the cracking continued, closer now. My mind raced through possibilities. I had heard stories of hikers who stumbled into dangerous situations, lost hunters, thieves, even people who liked to ambush campers. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that the forest was vast and that anyone nearby would probably be just another hiker. But instinctively, I felt a need to be ready. I started preparing my campsite defensively. I moved my backpack closer to the tent, keeping it between myself and the trees. I made sure my flashlight had fresh batteries and that I had my phone and GPS ready. The sound of the steps continued, occasionally breaking through with a louder snap of a branch, as if whatever it was testing its surroundings. My stomach tightened. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound that didn't match any animal I knew. It was subtle at first, a growl-like vibration in the air, then stronger as the source moved closer. I realized it wasn't a wild animal, it was human. Someone was moving deliberately, slowly, making sure I could hear them. My mind went through scenarios. If it was a lost hiker, they would probably call out, but there was no call. If it was someone with ill intentions, I had to be prepared to defend myself. I did something I had never done before. I silently packed up my tent and stove as quickly as possible, keeping my movements low and slow. I tried to avoid making any sound that might attract attention. I stuffed my food and supplies into my backpack, already calculating a route back to the main trail. I wanted to get out before they got close, but I didn't want to make a run of it yet. Running might draw attention. The steps came closer, now clearly within sight range. I could just make out movement between the trees. Someone or something was there, moving cautiously, deliberately, keeping the shadows of the pines as cover. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered that my best chance was to avoid confrontation, to move quietly and use the terrain. I waited until the movement paused. Then I slipped into the forest in the opposite direction. The undergrowth was thick, and I had to crouch low to avoid making noise. I kept checking behind me, trying to keep the stranger out of sight. The forest floor was uneven, covered with roots and fallen branches, making each step a careful calculation. I could hear the faint snapping behind me as they shifted, but there was no immediate pursuit. I moved steadily, aiming to reach the main trail marked on my map. Every nerve in my body was alert. My flashlight was off. I didn't want to give away my position. I navigated using the fading light and the faint outlines of trees, rocks, and hills. At one point, I nearly stepped on a large rock and had to freeze as the person behind me shuffled past without noticing. My stomach ached from tension and fear, but I pushed forward, keeping low, using the terrain to mask my movements. Hours seemed to pass like minutes, the night thick and silent except for the occasional sound of the unknown figure behind me. My legs burned from crouching and climbing over fallen logs, and my hands were scraped and bleeding from branches. I had to remind myself to breathe, to think clearly, to keep moving. Panic would have been deadly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached a small ridge I recognized from the map. Beyond it was the main trail I had come in on, and once I was there, I knew I could move faster without fear of losing my bearings. I paused behind a large boulder, listening. The forest was silent. I didn't hear the footsteps anymore. I could still feel the presence of someone watching, but I had bought a crucial moment. I moved quickly but carefully down the ridge, eventually reaching the trail. The familiar crunch of leaves underfoot no longer sounded threatening. It was a sound that guided me, proof that I was returning to safety. I kept moving, jogging when I could, keeping an eye on the trees but not looking too long in any one direction. The trail led me back to the parking area, and by the time I saw the outline of my car in the dim moonlight, I was shaking from exhaustion, adrenaline, and relief. I locked the doors, sat inside, and finally let my body relax. The reality of the night settled in. I had been hours from home, alone in the forest, with someone who might have intended harm, and yet I had survived by staying calm, moving carefully, and using my wits. I drove away slowly, the engine noise somehow comforting after the silent terror of the woods. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped at a small diner to collect myself. The lights, the warmth, the soft hum of conversation. It was like emerging from a different world. I realized I had been lucky, but I also realized that I would never underestimate the importance of situational awareness and preparedness again. I never saw who or what had followed me that night, but the memory stayed with me, vivid and frightening. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the forest only in daylight, and always with friends. I still loved camping, but the night in Black Pine Ridge had taught me that the forest, while beautiful, could hide dangers I had not considered. I became meticulous in planning every trip, studying maps carefully, noting alternate routes, always keeping my senses alert. That night changed the way I approached solitude and survival. Looking back now, I understand that fear is not something to be eliminated, it is something to respect. It is a signal, a tool. The forest will always have its shadows, and not all of them are harmless. But preparation, awareness, and calm thinking can make the difference between a terrifying memory and a tragedy. That night, I survived because I kept my mind clear, trusted my instincts, and moved carefully. I left the forest with a new respect for its power and for the unpredictability of other humans. I still remember the smell of damp pine needles and the cold bite of the night air. I remember the silence that felt alive and watchful. I remember moving through the shadows with only a knife, a backpack, and the belief that I had to survive. And I remember the relief of finally seeing the lights of the road, the quiet sense of triumph that comes from knowing I made it through something terrifying without giving in to panic. That night changed me. I no longer take solitude lightly. I no longer assume the forest is a safe place just because it is beautiful, and I no longer underestimate the power of staying alert. I have returned to that region many times since, but never at night and never alone. The forest still calls to me, but I now understand that respect and caution are as important as courage. That night was a lesson I will never forget. The wilderness is real, and the threats within it are as much human as they are natural. Surviving it requires more than equipment. It requires awareness, patience, and the ability to act under pressure, to think clearly when every instinct is screaming fear. And that is what saved me. I had planned this trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple escape from the city, a weekend camping trip deep in the forest, away from the noise and the constant glare of screens. I packed my backpack with the usual gear: a tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, some canned food, water, a first aid kit, and my map and compass. I told myself I was experienced enough to handle anything. I had been camping before, done overnight hikes, and even navigated some moderately difficult trails. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that trip. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, when the sun had barely risen. The forest was still damp with dew, and the air smelled like earth and pine needles. Birds were beginning to stir, and somewhere in the distance, a stream gurgled over rocks. I felt a sense of calm, walking along the narrow dirt path that led deeper into the forest. I had chosen a campsite that was several miles in, a spot that, according to my research, was relatively isolated and rarely visited. I liked the idea of solitude, of being completely alone with nature, away from the distractions of the modern world. The hike to the campsite was longer and more grueling than I anticipated. The path wound through dense woods, and in several places, fallen trees forced me to scramble over or around them. The air was heavy and humid, and my legs burned from the constant incline. Occasionally, I heard the snap of twigs behind me and turned instinctively, but I was alone. Still, there was an uneasy feeling that something was watching, that I was not entirely alone. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination and the natural sounds of the forest. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a creek. It wasn't the exact site I had planned, but it would do. I could hear water trickling over rocks, and the ground was level enough for my tent. I set up my camp meticulously, making sure the tent was secure, the sleeping bag rolled out neatly, and my supplies organized. I collected firewood from the surrounding area, careful to choose dry branches and twigs. As I worked, I noticed small signs that someone or something had passed through this area recently. Broken branches, footprints in the soft mud near the creek. They were human-sized, but I could not tell if they were fresh. I told myself it was probably another camper or a hiker who had passed through days ago. Still, I made a mental note to stay alert once night fell. As the sun began to set, I built a small fire near my tent, just enough to keep me warm and light the area. The forest transformed around me. Shadows stretched long and dark, and the temperature dropped quickly. I ate a simple meal of canned beans and rice, then sat by the fire watching the woods. The sounds of the forest intensified. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the crackle of my fire. It was peaceful, but there was an underlying tension, a sense that the forest could hide dangers just out of sight. Around 10 in the evening, I decided to turn in. I extinguished the fire, leaving a small line of embers just in case, and crawled into my sleeping bag. I kept my flashlight within reach and my knife strapped to my belt, more as a comfort than a necessity. I had never needed it before, and I hoped I wouldn't need it now. Sleep came slowly. Every creak of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth made me tense. It was a strange combination of calm and fear, the solitude making me hyper-aware of every sound. Sometime around midnight, I woke abruptly. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the underbrush near my campsite. My heart began to race. I stayed perfectly still, listening, trying to determine the direction. The footsteps stopped, then started again, circling my camp. My first thought was that it could be an animal, maybe a bear or a coyote, but the pattern was wrong. These were human footsteps. Heavy, careful, and unnervingly close. I reached for my flashlight and knife, ready to defend myself if necessary. I held my breath, trying to decide what to do. Leaving the tent in the middle of the night would be dangerous, especially without knowing who or what was outside. I stayed hidden, listening as the steps moved along the edge of the clearing. Then, unexpectedly, the footsteps stopped. The forest became silent again, except for the faint whisper of the creek. I tried to convince myself it was over, that whoever it was had moved on, but sleep was impossible after that. Every shadow, every small sound, felt threatening. I spent the rest of the night awake, clutching my knife and flashlight, waiting for something I hoped would never come. Morning brought some relief, though the unease lingered. I ate a quick breakfast and packed most of my things, deciding to stay alert while considering whether I should continue or turn back. While gathering my supplies, I noticed something alarming. The footprints I had seen at night had left marks near my tent, fresh, human-sized, leading from the tree-line to the edge of my fire pit and back. Someone had been there while I slept. The thought made my stomach turn, but I told myself to stay calm. Panic would only make mistakes more likely. I chose to move away from the clearing. I broke camp quickly, leaving no trace that I had been there, and followed a different trail toward a known exit point several miles away. The forest was deceptive, dense, full of twists, and sometimes disorienting. I tried to maintain a steady pace, listening carefully for any signs of movement behind me. Hours passed. Every time I stopped to rest, I checked the surrounding woods. There were occasional signs someone had been nearby: broken branches, crushed undergrowth, and footprints in the mud. The realization that I was being followed, or at least watched, was terrifying. I did not speak, did not make noise, just moved steadily, hoping my instincts and caution would keep me safe. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a point where the forest opened slightly, revealing a rough dirt path I had noted on my map. Relief surged through me. I was close to safety. I kept moving, heart hammering, eyes scanning constantly. Then I heard it. A shout, muffled but unmistakable, from somewhere in the trees behind me. My pulse jumped and I broke into a run. I ran through the uneven terrain, tripping over roots and rocks, desperate to reach the path. My lungs burned, but I did not stop. I could hear footsteps following, though I could not tell how far behind. Adrenaline and fear propelled me forward. Finally, I emerged onto the path, and in the distance, I could see a car parked near the main road. I sprinted toward it, not daring to look back. When I reached it, I jumped in and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and drove away, leaving the forest behind. The fear did not dissipate immediately, but I felt a sense of safety returning as the distance between me and the campsite grew. I reported the incident to the local ranger station later, describing the footprints and the sounds I had heard, and they confirmed that people sometimes use that area for illegal camping or other purposes. No one was ever caught, but I was told to be more cautious in remote areas in the future. The experience stayed with me long after the trip. I could not shake the feeling of being watched, of someone moving silently just out of sight. It changed the way I approached camping and hiking. I became more careful, always letting someone know where I was, carrying extra supplies, and trusting my instincts. I still loved the forest, the isolation, and the quiet, but I never again treated it as completely safe. That trip taught me that even in nature, where you feel free and alone, danger can be closer than you expect, and survival depends not just on skill and preparation, but on awareness and respect for what you cannot control. Looking back now, I am grateful I made it out unharmed. The forest is beautiful, yes, but it is also unpredictable and unforgiving. The lessons I learned on that trip, about vigilance, preparation, and the limits of human perception, are ones I carry with me every time I venture into the wilderness. The fear I felt that night was real, tangible, and it forced me to confront a truth I had never fully considered. The world is larger, stranger, and more dangerous than I had imagined, and the line between safety and peril can be thinner than a shadow in the trees. I had been planning this camping trip for months, mapping out a section of forest I had never visited before, deep enough that I would likely see no other human for the entire weekend. I liked that isolation. I liked the way it forced me to pay attention to every sound, every change in the air. I packed everything I thought I might need: a tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, plenty of food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a headlamp with extra batteries, a small stove, and of course my backpack. I made sure to wear proper hiking boots and layered clothing, the kind of preparation that, on paper, should have kept me safe or at least comfortable. The drive to the trailhead was long, through winding roads and dense woods, but I didn't mind. I was alone and I had the windows down. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. When I reached the small parking area, there were only a few cars, mostly older models, their owners likely taking short hikes. I double-checked my gear, strapped the backpack to my shoulders, and set off on the trail. The first mile was easy, a wide path through young pines, sunlight speckling the dirt and leaves beneath my feet. Birds called overhead. The sound was comforting. I felt like I had left the world behind. As I walked further, the trail narrowed, roots and rocks making each step deliberate. The forest grew thicker, older, the trees taller, their trunks scarred with moss. I passed a creek, its water clear and cold, and I stopped for a moment, dipping my hands in and splashing my face. The feeling of cold water on my skin made my heartbeat quicken, reminding me that I was alive, and that this solitude, as calming as it was, came with responsibility. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I had intended to camp, a small clearing I had found on a topographic map. It was ideal. Flat, dry ground, a few fallen logs for sitting, and a high ridge behind it that would provide shelter from wind. I set up my tent, laying the footprint carefully to keep it free of stones and roots. I hammered the stakes into the ground, careful to keep them tight. The forest around me had grown quiet, the birds having disappeared, leaving only the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional snap of a twig. I knew the wind would die down after sunset, leaving the night still and deep. After the tent was secure, I collected wood for a fire. I searched for dry pieces, small branches at first, then larger logs, layering them carefully. I had packed matches and a lighter, but I knew from experience that starting a fire in a damp forest could be tricky. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had a small fire crackling, its light flickering across the surrounding trees. The orange glow made shadows dance, and I could hear the forest differently now. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of a small animal in the underbrush, the whisper of leaves against each other. The night smelled of wet earth and pine. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, canned beans and rice, heating them in a small pot. The warmth of the fire, the effort of preparation, the taste of food, all of it made me feel more connected to this wild place. I washed my dishes in water I had filtered from the creek and placed everything securely in my backpack. Bears were a concern, but I had read up on safe food storage. I hung my food in a tree well away from the tent. As darkness fully settled, I lay in my sleeping bag inside the tent, listening. The wind had died completely. The forest was eerily still, the kind of stillness that makes your own heartbeat sound like a drum. I felt a kind of excitement, a tension that comes from being fully aware, fully present. Then I heard it. A sound that did not belong to the wind or the forest. A soft, deliberate snapping of twigs somewhere not far from my tent. I froze. The snapping continued intermittently, slow, careful. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or some other animal, but something about it was different. It moved closer, stopping, then starting again. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, swinging the beam carefully. Nothing. The forest looked normal, but shadows played tricks on my eyes. Every few seconds, I thought I saw movement between the trees. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was overreacting, that I was alone in the woods and my mind was starting to imagine things. I turned over in my sleeping bag, trying to block the sound with music in my head, but the snapping persisted. It had to be close, maybe 20 feet from my tent. I remembered I had packed a small knife in the tent for emergencies. I placed it within reach, feeling the cold metal handle against my fingers. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. It was impossible to tell in the forest night. The snapping came and went, never constant, always deliberate. My mind ran through possibilities. An animal, a person, maybe a hunter or another camper. The idea of another human, unknown, moving so close while I slept, made my stomach tighten. I realized my fire had burned down to embers, leaving the small clearing in near total darkness. I considered leaving the tent, hiking out immediately, but it was pitch dark, and the thought of stepping into unknown terrain without preparation was just as dangerous. I stayed inside, clutching my knife, listening. At some point, the sound changed. There was no longer the snapping of small twigs. Now it was heavier, deliberate steps, slow, careful, circling the clearing. My heart pounded. I stayed as still as possible, telling myself not to breathe loudly. The steps circled closer. I had to think. I remembered the advice I had read online about wildlife encounters. But this was not wildlife. The steps were too deliberate, human. Panic threatened to overtake me, but I forced myself to stay quiet, listening to every shift in the leaves, every small sound in the underbrush. The minutes dragged, the forest stretching endlessly around me. Then, without warning, the steps stopped. Silence. Absolute silence. My breathing felt loud in my own ears. I tried to convince myself the person had left, but instinct told me they were still there, watching, waiting. I checked my watch. Only 2 hours had passed since sunset, but it felt like an eternity. I waited, tense, alert, knowing that leaving the tent now would expose me to unknown danger. Morning finally arrived, pale light filtering through the trees. I unzipped the tent carefully, flashlight ready, and looked around. The clearing was empty. No signs of movement, no footprints visible in the soft earth. Relief surged, but I knew better than to relax completely. I packed my gear quickly, keeping my knife in hand, and left the site. I moved cautiously, sticking to the trail, my senses alert to every sound. Several miles later, I reached the main road where I had left my car. I never saw anyone or anything, and the forest appeared calm, unchanged, as if nothing had happened. I drove away slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror at the dense trees lining the road. The memory of that night stayed with me. The silence, the sound of deliberate footsteps, the feeling of being watched. I didn't camp in that forest again. But I learned something vital. Preparation and gear are important, yes, but awareness, patience, and trusting your instincts are what truly keep you safe in the wild. I often remember that night, not as an adventure gone wrong, but as a lesson in vigilance and survival, a reminder that being alone in the wilderness is both beautiful and dangerous, and that you can never truly take nature or other people completely for granted. The rest of the story of that weekend became mundane after I left the forest. I stayed in motels the next nights, bought extra food, and drove through open roads rather than hiking alone. But the forest had left a mark. Even weeks later, I could feel the tension of those hours pressing in on me when I closed my eyes, the feeling that someone or something had been there, observing, deliberate, patient. I never learned who it was, or why they had chosen to move so close while I slept. But the experience taught me respect for solitude, and respect for danger in its quietest forms. I had always loved camping, the way the forest seemed to breathe and shift around you, how the wind in the trees carried 1,000 tiny sounds that were hard to identify, yet strangely comforting. I'd grown up in the suburbs, surrounded by asphalt and streetlights, and whenever I got the chance to escape into the wild, I took it without hesitation. This time, I decided to venture further than I had before, to a stretch of wilderness I had read about in a few hiking blogs. It was supposed to be remote, untouched, and beautiful, with a small river cutting through a narrow valley, dense trees, and enough wildlife to make it feel alive. I packed my gear carefully: a tent, sleeping bag, a compact stove, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, and a small pack of essentials including a flashlight, extra batteries, a hatchet, and a water filter. I had been meticulous about my preparation, but looking back now, I can see the small things I ignored, the signs that things might not go as smoothly as I imagined. The drive out was long, winding through highways that gradually gave way to gravel roads and then to dirt tracks. As I got closer to the trailhead, the GPS signal became patchy. The last few turns were marked only by faded signs, barely legible, and the road narrowed until it became almost single lane. I parked my car, checked my pack one more time, and started on the trail just as the sun began to dip behind the distant hills, casting long, heavy shadows across the ground. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and moss, and I felt the familiar thrill of being entirely alone in nature. The trail was rougher than I expected. Tree roots twisted across the path, and patches of mud made every step tentative. I had a map, but it wasn't very detailed, so I relied mostly on trail markers painted in orange on the trees. The further I went, the more I realized how isolated this place was. I didn't see another hiker, didn't hear a voice, and for stretches, didn't hear any human sound at all. Only the occasional bird call, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, and the river running somewhere off to the right. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing near the riverbank that looked perfect for a campsite. It was flat, with enough space for my tent, and surrounded by tall pines that would shield me from the wind. I set up my tent carefully, hammered in the stakes, and arranged my gear inside. The river's sound was steady, almost hypnotic, and I sat by the bank for a while, just watching the water and feeling the calm settle over me. I collected some dry wood for a fire, knowing that once darkness fell, it would be essential not just for warmth, but for comfort. As night approached, I started the fire. The flames leapt up, crackling and spitting sparks, and I cooked a simple meal of rice and canned beans. The sun disappeared entirely, leaving only the fading orange glow on the horizon. The forest darkened gradually, shadows thickening until the world was reduced to black shapes, broken only by the flickering firelight. I felt alive, alert, but also aware of the fragility of my presence here. Out there, I was a small creature among many. After eating, I sat quietly, watching the flames, listening to the night. At first, it was peaceful, the chirping of insects, the occasional splash of a fish in the river, the rustle of a small animal moving through the underbrush. Then, slowly, I began to notice other sounds. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, soft but close. Not on the trail, not on the riverbank where I could see them, but moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The sounds weren't constant. They would appear, pause, and then resume, circling around the clearing. My mind raced, trying to account for them. Deer? Bears? Other humans? The thought of another human out here, so far from any road or trail, made my stomach tighten. Bears were a real possibility. The last thing I wanted was to surprise a bear at night, especially without the safety of a vehicle or proper barriers. I grabbed my hatchet, holding it loosely but ready. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me flinch. The forest around me seemed alive in a new way, darker and more menacing. I stayed near the fire, letting the light and the warmth anchor me. The sounds continued intermittently, and I realized they were too measured, too quiet for an animal. Someone or something was moving carefully, deliberately around my camp. Hours passed like this. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that the sounds were just the natural movement of wildlife, but deep down, I knew it was different. By the time the fire burned low, I had my sleeping bag ready and my flashlight within arm's reach. I crawled into my tent, zipped it tightly, and sat inside, trying to calm my racing heart. Outside, I could still hear movement, soft but persistent, circling the camp. I didn't sleep. Every rustle made me tense. Every snapping branch sent adrenaline through my body. I kept my hatchet ready and my flashlight close. Hours dragged by, the darkness seeming to stretch endlessly, the movement outside never ceasing entirely. At some point, the sounds stopped. Too quiet. I didn't dare leave the tent to look. The forest felt like a living, watching thing, and I stayed still, barely breathing. By the early morning, light began to seep through the tent fabric. The first real sense of relief in hours, but also a new set of dangers. Daylight would show me what I was dealing with, or at least allow me to move. I waited until the sun was high enough to light the clearing before I unzipped the tent slowly. The forest was empty, eerily quiet. No footprints, no movement, nothing. My fire had burned down to ashes, and I carefully stepped outside, scanning the area. It was then I noticed the tracks. Not animal tracks, too large, too deliberate. Boots. Someone had been circling my camp, moving around carefully, staying just out of sight of the fire. They hadn't tried to touch anything, hadn't left any signs that they'd been close enough to harm me yet. But the knowledge that someone had been here all night, watching, made my skin crawl. I packed quickly, leaving no trace that I had been there longer than necessary. The hike back was tense. Every shadow, every sound made me flinch. I kept the map in hand, watched the trail markers, and walked faster than I had on the way in. I never saw anyone, never heard anyone follow, but the sense of being watched lingered, gnawing at me. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking, exhausted, and hyper-aware of every sound of the forest behind me. I didn't report it immediately. There was no clear evidence that anyone had been there, and I didn't want to seem paranoid, but the experience stayed with me. I realized that nature, while beautiful and calming, could also hide dangers that were human, not wild. People could move through it silently, and you might not know until it was too late. After that trip, I became much more cautious. I started choosing campsites closer to populated trails, always telling someone where I was going, carrying extra means of defense, and learning to read signs of human presence in the wilderness. I still camp, still hike, but I never forget that time, the night I felt watched, circling shadows in the dark, the footsteps that weren't animal, and the long, tense hours I spent waiting in my tent, wondering what someone might do if I made the wrong move. Looking back, I realize I survived because of preparation and caution. My fire, my careful packing, and the fact that I stayed alert and didn't venture into unknown territory in the dark all contributed. And while I never saw the person or understood their intent, I learned something essential. The wilderness is beautiful, but it can be dangerous, not just because of the natural elements, but because of the people who might be there before you, quietly, unseen. I also learned that fear can be a tool. It keeps you alert, keeps you alive. In the weeks afterward, I returned with friends to the same region, properly equipped, during the daytime, and explored it fully. The valley, the river, and the forest were as beautiful as I had imagined, but I never forgot that night. Every hike now included careful planning, constant awareness, and respect for the fact that the forest is home not only to wildlife, but sometimes to other humans whose presence is unpredictable. I could enjoy it fully, safely, knowing that preparation, caution, and attention to detail can prevent a terrifying experience from becoming a tragedy. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I live for the quiet of the forest, the way the wind moves through the trees, the smell of wet soil and pine needles after rain, and the sharp cold of night when it hits bare skin. I needed to get away from everything: work, noise, people, and just be alone in the wild. I had researched the area carefully, checked maps, and packed thoroughly. I brought enough food for 5 days, extra water, a reliable first aid kit, and even a small, portable solar charger for my phone, although I didn't intend to use it much. My plan was simple: hike to a secluded spot deep in the forest, set up camp, and spend a few days alone with nothing but nature. The hike started smoothly. The sun was warm, filtering through the tall trees, and a light breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth. Birds moved overhead, chirping in the usual chaos of the forest, and somewhere in the distance, a stream gurgled as it wound its way through the underbrush. I followed the trail marked on my map, which was narrow but well-defined, with occasional markers painted on trees. My backpack was heavy, but manageable, and I kept my pace steady, stopping occasionally to take photographs or just breathe in the quiet. By mid-afternoon, I had left the main trail and entered a section of the forest that was less traveled. The trees were taller and closer together, creating long shadows even in the bright sun. I crossed small creeks and jumped over mossy logs, careful to keep my footing on slippery rocks. I was exhilarated. Being alone in this part of the forest felt freeing. The air was cooler, cleaner, and the world felt stripped down to its simplest elements: earth, water, trees, and the raw physicality of walking through it. I chose a small clearing surrounded by tall pines to set up my tent. It wasn't far from a small stream, which I considered ideal because I could refill my water bottle easily. The clearing was almost perfectly flat, with soft soil covered in pine needles, and I felt satisfied that this would be a good spot for the night. I set up my tent carefully, hammering the stakes into the ground and tightening the lines. Everything seemed ordinary at first, almost peaceful. I collected firewood nearby, some dry and some damp, knowing that fire would be essential once the sun went down. I built a small pile, arranging it neatly so that it would catch easily. I then explored a bit around the clearing, marking certain trees with small bits of tape I had brought, just to know my bearings if I had to leave the tent in the dark. I made mental notes of natural landmarks: a twisted tree that looked like a claw, a fallen log covered in moss, a large rock beside the stream that would be visible even in dim light. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sky was already beginning to shift toward evening, the sunlight golden and soft. As night approached, the forest changed. The sounds of birds faded, replaced by crickets, frogs, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I built a fire, carefully stacking the logs and lighting them with a small match. The flames flickered and grew, casting light and shadows across the clearing. I sat close to the fire, letting its warmth seep into my bones. I ate a simple dinner. Canned beans heated over the fire, some bread, and water. Everything felt calm, almost too calm. I checked my supplies again and made sure everything was secured. My knife was within reach, and I knew where my small first aid kit was, just in case. The night was falling quickly, and I was alone in the forest, but I felt confident. I wasn't afraid yet. It started with small noises. At first, it was just a rustle in the distance, almost like a branch snapping underfoot. I told myself it was nothing, probably a deer or a raccoon. But then it happened again, closer this time. A soft crunching of leaves, almost deliberate. I froze, listening. The wind was calm, so any movement in the underbrush was noticeable. My heart rate quickened. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but something about the pattern of movement felt off. It wasn't the random, jerky motion of a deer. It was slower, more careful, as if whatever it was aware of me and moving with intent. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness beyond the fire's reach. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating nothing but trees, rocks, and underbrush. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing, only the faint sound of my own breathing. I laughed nervously, telling myself I was imagining things. But then the noises got closer. Something was moving around the edge of the clearing, always just beyond the reach of the firelight. Every few seconds, a twig would snap or a leaf would rustle. I could hear breathing now, though faint, uneven, not the steady rhythm of a normal person walking. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly, and my flashlight. My survival instincts were kicking in, and suddenly the forest felt oppressive and dangerous. I felt the sweat on my forehead, not from heat, but from tension. The night had gone from serene to threatening in minutes. I tried to stay calm. I told myself I needed to assess the situation rationally. The only options I had were to either stay put or run to my car, which was over 2 miles away on the trail I had left hours before. I considered my chances if I ran through the forest in the dark. Twisted ankles, unseen roots, uneven ground, almost certain injury. Staying might be safer, at least until I could see better. I decided to stay near the fire, keeping my flashlight and knife ready. The rustling intensified. Now, I could hear the sound of careful footsteps circling the clearing. Whoever or whatever it was aware of me. I tried to make myself look larger, banging a piece of firewood against a rock to create noise. I shone the flashlight toward the edges of the clearing, swinging it in wide arcs. The sounds paused, then resumed, now accompanied by something else. Faint whispers of movement, like the soft dragging of a bag or fabric across leaves. My mind raced, imagining the worst scenarios. I realized I had no cell service. Even if I screamed or called for help, nobody would hear me. I was completely alone. The fear became physical. My stomach churned, my hands shook, my legs trembled. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I kept making noise with sticks and stones, trying to intimidate whoever was out there. But there was no response except for the continued circling. I decided I had to make a plan. The stream near my camp could be both a hindrance and a help. If I stayed near it, I could use it as a natural boundary, but it also limited my mobility. I thought about retreating slowly toward the denser forest where I could potentially find higher ground. But moving without knowing where they were seemed reckless. I stayed near the fire, hoping that light and sound would deter them. Hours passed. Every shadow seemed alive. Every crack of a branch made my stomach drop. Eventually, I noticed patterns. The movements weren't random. Whoever was circling seemed hesitant to get too close, almost as if they were testing me. I realized I needed a signal, something that could startle them without putting me at risk. I remembered the small flare I had packed for emergencies. It was designed to be seen from far away, loud and bright. I considered using it if they came too close, but I still hoped I could avoid confrontation. I didn't know if it was one person or more, and I couldn't risk being ambushed. I kept the flare in my hand, waiting for the moment when it would be necessary. Then, just before midnight, the circling stopped. The forest became eerily quiet, only the crackling of my fire filling the air. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the presence. My instincts screamed that they were still there, watching, waiting for a mistake. I stayed awake, rigid, hardly daring to breathe. Every sound, an owl hooting, the rustle of leaves, made me tense, expecting an attack. Hours passed slowly. I maintained a constant vigil, keeping my fire going, replenishing it with small sticks and logs. The physical exhaustion was intense, but sleep was impossible. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. Finally, the first light of morning filtered through the trees. The golden glow felt surreal after the long night of tension. I peered cautiously into the shadows around the clearing. There was no one. Nothing moved. No footprints, no signs of human presence, only the usual tracks of animals, squirrels, deer, and birds. I felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. The danger had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. I realized that whoever had been circling me had retreated under the cover of darkness, possibly deterred by my fire, my noise, or maybe just my visible vigilance. I spent the next hours cautiously packing up my campsite, scanning the forest constantly. I didn't know if they were gone for good or just waiting somewhere else. I made the decision to leave immediately. I packed everything efficiently, tying up my tent and belongings securely, and moved slowly but steadily toward the trail I had come from. The forest, now bathed in sunlight, seemed less threatening, but I still kept my senses alert. I stayed near open areas when possible, avoiding dense undergrowth where someone could hide. I kept my knife ready and my eyes scanning for any movement. After several hours, I reached a more familiar section of the trail. Signs of hikers, footprints, broken branches gave me a small sense of security. I continued at a steady pace, adrenaline still running through me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I emerged from the forest onto a dirt road. I could see cars parked in the distance, and soon after, the sound of traffic reached my ears. Relief washed over me. I had survived the night. I was exhausted, covered in dirt and sweat, but alive. I paused to catch my breath, taking in the sunlit landscape and the distant mountains, feeling a profound appreciation for safety, light, and civilization. I drove home slowly, constantly scanning the forest edges, replaying the night over and over in my mind. I realized how easily a simple camping trip could have turned disastrous, and I vowed never to take the forest's quiet for granted again. That night had taught me about vigilance, preparation, and the unpredictable nature of being alone in the wilderness. I had faced fear in its purest form, the unknown, the unseen, and the possibility of real danger. And I had survived, using nothing but caution, observation, and the will to live. The experience stayed with me, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the need to respect the wild. I had been planning this camping trip for months, and the moment I finally arrived at the trailhead, the mix of excitement and nervousness hit me in waves. The air was crisp and dry, carrying a faint scent of pine and earth. It was early September, the kind of time when the forest was not yet cold, but the nights promised a bite of winter that could catch anyone unprepared. I parked my old SUV at the edge of the small gravel lot, my backpack already loaded in the back with all the gear I thought I might need. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, water filter, flashlight, extra batteries, and a small axe. I had even packed a compact bear spray canister just in case. I started the trail in the late afternoon, taking my time to adjust to the rhythm of hiking with a full pack. The path was narrow, lined with tall pines and scattered rocks. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, making shifting patterns on the forest floor, and the occasional bird call punctuated the silence. First, everything felt normal. I passed a small creek, the water bubbling over stones, clear and cold, and I knelt to drink a small sip, feeling the chill run down my throat. As I walked deeper into the forest, the trail became less maintained, the signs of human activity fading. I kept checking my map and compass, double-checking that I was on the right route toward a small clearing I had chosen as my campsite. I wanted to be off the beaten path, away from other campers. Part of the appeal of camping alone was the silence, the kind of quiet that made the brain more aware of the smallest details. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig underfoot, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing. It was bigger than I had imagined. A flat patch of ground surrounded by tall pines and a few oaks, with a small, stagnant pond at one edge. It was perfect in terms of isolation, but I immediately noticed how exposed it felt. The trees around it were far enough apart that I could see movement from a distance, but they weren't dense enough to provide much cover. I set my pack down and took a moment to look around, scanning the edges of the clearing. Nothing moved, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I told myself it was just nerves. I set up my tent near the back of the clearing, close enough to the tree-line for some wind protection. I carefully cleared the ground of sticks and rocks, then laid my footprint and tent over it, securing each stake. Inside, I organized my sleeping bag, gear, and essentials, making sure everything was easily accessible. Once that was done, I took my stove out and boiled water for dinner, dehydrated chili mixed with rice. The forest around me started to darken as the sun dipped lower, and the shadows grew long and strange. Even the familiar sounds of birds began to fade, replaced by a subtle chorus of crickets and distant, echoing calls from unseen animals. After eating, I washed my dishes in water from my filter, then poured the used water far from the tent to avoid attracting wildlife. I stacked my gear carefully, making sure nothing smelled too strongly, remembering the advice from every guide I had read. Keep food away from your sleeping area, hang anything aromatic in a tree if you can. Then I sat down on a small log near my tent and just breathed in the forest, letting my mind slow after the hike. As darkness fully descended, I noticed how quiet it had become. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a forest at dusk. It was the heavier quiet that comes when larger animals are awake, when small things scurry unseen in the undergrowth, and when the mind starts to play tricks. I checked my flashlight and then, as a precaution, my knife and bear spray. I told myself I was being paranoid. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay in my sleeping bag. My breathing slowed, and I felt the familiar calm of being alone in the wild. Then I heard it. A low, dragging sound from the tree-line, faint but deliberate, like something large was moving slowly through the brush. I froze. My heart rate jumped, and I strained my ears. The sound stopped, then moved again, closer this time. I could hear twigs snapping under weight, leaves rustling, a soft, wet thud every few seconds. I switched on my flashlight, shining it into the darkness outside the tent. The beam cut through the shadows, but I saw nothing. I whispered to myself that it was probably a deer, or maybe a raccoon, and tried to relax, but every few seconds my eyes darted to the edge of the clearing. Then I heard the sound of heavy breathing, faint, but human. My stomach dropped. My mind raced, thinking of all the scenarios. A lost hiker, an armed trespasser, someone who had been hiding nearby. I got out of my sleeping bag carefully, keeping my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. The night was cold, the temperature already dropping below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I peered into the tree-line again. Shadows moved unnaturally, and then I caught a glimpse of a figure crouching behind a tree, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I backed into my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to think rationally. I decided to stay put. The figure didn't make any aggressive movements, just stayed at the edge of the tree-line, partially hidden. I knew that if I made a sudden move, it could trigger a dangerous response. I remembered the advice in survival guides. Don't panic, make yourself appear confident, and wait for the intruder to move away if possible. I sat inside my tent, flashlight ready, heart pounding, and tried to remain as quiet as possible. Hours passed like this. Every rustle, every crack of a branch made me jump. Couldn't sleep. I tried to stay calm, imagining ways to get out safely in daylight. The figure never left, always just beyond the edge of the clearing. When the first gray light of dawn appeared, I peeked out of my tent. The figure was gone. No footprints, no discarded items. Nothing. It was as if they had vanished. I cautiously exited the tent, scanning the area. Everything looked normal now, but the memory of the night kept my muscles tense. I decided to pack up immediately. I broke down my tent, packed my gear, and kept my knife and flashlight ready. I took a route slightly different from the one I had hiked in, keeping an eye on the treeline for any signs of movement. The forest was alive with birds and squirrels now, the early morning light warm on my face, but I still felt a tension in my shoulders that wouldn't go away. On my hike out, I found subtle clues that made my stomach churn. Footprints in soft mud that weren't mine. The snap of small branches that didn't coincide with my steps. A makeshift shelter of branches and leaves that someone had abandoned in the night. Each clue confirmed that I hadn't imagined the figure. Someone had been out there watching me, close enough to strike if they wanted. By mid-morning, I finally reached the trailhead. My hands were blistered, my back sore, and my nerves frayed, but I felt an overwhelming relief at the sight of my SUV. I locked the doors behind me, sat in the driver's seat, and exhaled slowly. The forest was still in my rearview mirror, beautiful and quiet in the daylight, but the memory of the night stayed with me. I drove away slowly, glancing at the trees lining the road, and thought about how easily things could have gone wrong. I told myself I had been lucky, that my caution, preparation, and restraint had kept me safe. I also realized something else. Even when everything seems peaceful in the wilderness, there's always a chance that danger is closer than you think, and sometimes the most frightening things aren't the animals or the weather. They're the humans you don't see until it's too late. Back home, I unpacked my gear carefully, checked for anything that might have been tampered with, and filed away the experience as a hard lesson in wilderness awareness. I decided I would still camp again. I loved the outdoors, but I would never underestimate how unpredictable it could be. I would stick to busier trails, or at least make sure someone knew exactly where I was. I would carry more than one flashlight, more than one defensive tool, and trust my instincts no matter how irrational they might feel. Weeks later, I returned to the same area, but this time with a friend and in daylight, sticking to well-marked trails. I still remembered the feeling of being watched, the fear that had made the forest feel like a trap. The experience had changed me, made me sharper, more aware, and more cautious, but it had not taken away my love for the wilderness. I realized that fear, when managed correctly, could be a tool rather than a threat. And even though I had survived that night alone, I now respected the forest in a new way, one that blended awe with caution. In the end, I survived not because of luck alone, but because I prepared, stayed calm, and respected the unknown. And every time I step into the woods now, I carry that lesson with me. The forest is beautiful, dangerous, and utterly indifferent. Respect it, and it will let you go home. Underestimate it, and it won't. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted solitude, fresh air, and a break from the constant hum of city life. The nearest wilderness area was several hours from my home, a stretch of forest known for its dense trees, narrow trails, and a river that twisted through the middle like a silver snake. I had been there once before, years ago, on a short day hike, but this time I intended to camp for 3 nights deep inside the woods. I packed meticulously, making sure I had enough food, water, clothes, a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, a first aid kit, and some basic survival tools. A hatchet, a small folding saw, a compass, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a multi-tool. I double-checked everything before I left, convinced that preparation was the key to safety. The drive out was long and monotonous, stretching across 2-lane highways and bumpy back roads. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror as I went, noticing the way the trees on either side gradually thickened and darkened, the sun beginning to sink lower behind them. When I finally reached the trailhead, the forest was almost impenetrable in appearance, a dense wall of green that seemed to absorb the sunlight. A few cars were parked there, empty now, and the small wooden sign warned hikers about the difficulty of the trails ahead. I checked my watch and my pack, adjusted the straps, and started the hike. The first few hours were easy. The trail was narrow but defined, twisting along small streams and rocky outcroppings. Birds chirped intermittently, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush reminded me I was not entirely alone. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. Occasionally, I would come across a large fallen tree, its roots protruding like the skeleton of some long-dead creature, or a narrow section where the trail had been washed out by rain. I moved carefully, mindful of every step. By mid-afternoon, I had reached a small clearing near the river, a perfect spot to set up camp. The river flowed steadily, the water clear but cold, glinting silver in the last rays of the sun. I chose a spot slightly elevated from the riverbank to avoid potential flooding. I unpacked the tent and started setting it up, hammering stakes into the damp ground with my hatchet. By the time I finished, my arms were sore, but the sun was low enough that the forest shadows were lengthening, stretching like dark fingers across the ground. I decided to gather firewood next. The forest was littered with dead branches and fallen logs. I carefully collected enough to last the night, choosing pieces that were dry and would burn steadily. As I carried the pile back to camp, the shadows grew longer and darker. The forest suddenly felt heavier, almost suffocating, as if the air itself had thickened. Every small sound, the crack of a twig underfoot, the flutter of wings, the sudden splash of something in the river, made me jump. I reminded myself that I was overthinking, that nothing dangerous was out there, but I still felt the tension in my shoulders. By the time the fire was lit, the sun had disappeared completely, leaving only a dim, dusky glow. The forest was alive with night sounds. The distant hoot of an owl, the low croak of frogs, the rustling of leaves as small animals scurried through the underbrush. I sat close to the fire, warming my hands, and ate a simple meal of canned beans and bread. As darkness settled fully, I realized how isolated I truly was. No other campers, no hikers, no sounds of cars. Just the forest and me. I went to bed early, trying to ignore the nervous energy that made it hard to fall asleep. The tent walls shivered with every gust of wind, and the river's constant rush became a low, persistent roar in the background. Sleep came fitfully. Several times, I woke to the sound of movement nearby, but each time, after a moment of listening, nothing appeared. I tried to convince myself it was deer or raccoons, nothing to worry about. Around midnight, the first incident happened. I woke suddenly to a loud snap, like a heavy branch breaking under weight. My heart raced. I sat up slowly, listening. The sound had come from the direction of the trail that led to my camp. I could see the glow of the fire flickering against the inside of the tent. I didn't hear anything else at first. Then, the sound of something dragging across the ground, intermittent thumps, heavy and uneven. I stayed perfectly still, trying not to make a sound, and watched. The movement stopped, and after several tense minutes, I convinced myself it was probably a deer or another large animal. I tried to sleep again, but the sounds continued. Every now and then, I heard distant rustling, sometimes heavy steps, sometimes a low snuffle. My imagination ran wild. I reminded myself that this forest was home to bears and coyotes, but I had stored my food carefully and had no scent outside. Still, the uncertainty gnawed at me. Around 2 a.m., I heard a series of loud cracks, like branches snapping, followed by a guttural snort. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and shone it outside the tent. The beam caught nothing but the dense blackness of the trees. I strained to listen. The sounds were coming closer, or at least it felt that way. My stomach twisted. I considered leaving, running, but the forest was dark, and every shadow seemed like a threat. I had no idea what I would run into. I decided to stay in the tent and make as little noise as possible. I grabbed my hatchet and kept it within reach, every sense on high alert. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by occasional distant sounds. Every noise made me flinch. Every shadow made me hold my breath. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night. By the time dawn broke, the forest was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had been out there. The next day, I tried to convince myself that I had imagined the sounds. I packed lightly, planning to explore a little further down the river and possibly find a higher, safer campsite. The forest was deceptive in daylight. Every tree and rock seemed familiar, yet I constantly had the sense of being watched. The trail grew narrower and more overgrown. Fallen trees blocked some paths, and mud made footing difficult. I kept my hatchet ready and walked cautiously, scanning for any sign of danger. By midday, I found a spot that looked promising. A small rise overlooking the river, with enough space to set up the tent again. I unpacked, set up camp, and started gathering firewood. I noticed broken branches near the trail, deeper than natural decay should have caused. The pattern was uneven, as if something large had moved through deliberately. I froze for a long moment, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Still, the sense of unease lingered. That evening, as I prepared the fire and cooked a small meal, I realized I had forgotten to refill my water supply. The river was close, but I hesitated to go too far. I had a small filter, but dipping into a river while alone at night seemed foolish. I decided to wait until daylight to collect water. The sun disappeared again, and the forest became dark and silent. I ate quickly, lit the fire, and stayed near it, every nerve alert. At around 11 p.m., the noises started again, louder this time. Snaps and thuds, the sound of something large moving just beyond the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the trees, but saw nothing. Then something shifted in the shadows, a brief, large shape. My heart leaped into my throat. Whatever it was enormous. I clutched my hatchet tightly, realizing that it could be a bear. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, hoping it would move on. Hours passed like this. Every crack and rustle made me jump, but nothing attacked. I finally noticed that the fire was low, and I had to feed it more wood. Trembling, I gathered branches carefully, throwing them on the fire, making as much noise as possible to keep whatever was nearby from approaching. I stayed awake the entire night again, alternating between tending the fire and scanning the dark forest with my flashlight. The next morning, I decided that staying any longer was too dangerous. The forest had something large and potentially aggressive moving through it. I packed my gear with extreme care, double-checking my food, water, and supplies. Every noise made me tense. As I walked along the trail back toward the main path, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see movement, expecting an attack at any moment. After several hours of cautious hiking, I finally reached the main trail, where it was more open and easier to navigate. The sense of constant threat began to ease slightly. I reached the trailhead, exhausted and shaken, but unharmed. I looked back once at the dense forest, knowing I had experienced something real, something dangerous, and I had survived through careful planning, vigilance, and sheer luck. I drove home slowly. The image of the dark forest burned into my memory. I had gone seeking solitude and adventure, and I had found fear in its rawest form. But I also felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I had tested myself, faced real danger, and emerged alive and intact. I knew I would return to the wilderness someday, but never again unprepared, never again underestimating the power and unpredictability of nature. The forest had shown me its quiet, deadly side, and I would never forget the lessons it had taught. I had been planning this camping trip for months. It wasn't some glamorous expedition or a trek into some famous national park. It was just me, my small tent, and a section of forest a few hours away from the nearest town. I needed the solitude. I had spent the weeks before obsessing over maps, weather reports, and survival tips. I wanted something quiet, away from people, away from noise, away from anything that reminded me of work, bills, or city life. My backpack was heavy, filled with food, water, and gear. More than I probably needed, but I always preferred to be overprepared. The drive there was long, and as I left the paved roads behind, the world seemed to shift. The trees grew denser, the air cooler, and the sky a softer gray, diffused by clouds that hinted at rain but never quite unleashed it. I parked my car at the trailhead early in the afternoon, double-checked my supplies, and started walking. At first, the trail was easy, wide, and soft underfoot, but after a couple of hours, it narrowed, twisted, and became rough. Tree roots jutted out from the soil, slick with damp moss. Every step required attention. I finally found a spot that seemed perfect, a small clearing by a creek. The ground was flat, the trees around me dense enough to block the wind, and there was a soft slope leading down to the water. I set up my tent, hammered the stakes into the ground, and made a small fire pit with stones I gathered from the creek. I had a small camping stove, but I liked the fire. It made the place feel alive. I spent the rest of the afternoon chopping firewood, arranging my supplies, and walking along the creek, soaking in the peacefulness of the forest. As the sun began to drop, shadows stretched long across the clearing. That's when I first noticed the noises. Not the normal forest noises, the rustle of leaves, the distant bird call, but something heavier, something deliberate. Snap, crack, footsteps over dry leaves. I froze and listened. There was nothing in sight, just the whispering of the creek and the occasional wind through the pines. I shrugged it off as an animal, probably a deer or something. It wasn't unusual to hear wildlife moving around at dusk. I cooked dinner, ate slowly, and watched the fire. The forest darkened rapidly, and soon the only light was from the flames and the crescent moon overhead. That's when the noises started again. Louder this time, closer. It wasn't a single sound, but multiple, like someone or something was circling the clearing. Snap, step, snap. A small branch cracked under weight, and the sound of leaves crunching pressed against my nerves. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it in every direction, but I saw nothing. The firelight created strange shapes, shadows stretching in impossible angles. I tried to convince myself that it was just small animals, maybe raccoons, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Hours passed, and the noises seemed to follow me. Whenever I moved or looked away, there would be a snap of a twig, the crunch of leaves, a brush against branches. I started keeping my knife in hand, just in case. By midnight, I was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. The forest had a way of twisting perception. Every sound became a threat. Every shadow looked like a figure crouched in the trees. I lay in my sleeping bag, ears straining, waiting for something to happen. At around 2 a.m., I heard it. The sound of my name whispered. Just once, so soft I thought I imagined it. But then again louder. My blood ran cold. I told myself it was impossible, that no one could have followed me here. But fear was something that doesn't listen to logic. My heart was racing, adrenaline flooding my body, making my hands shake as I gripped the knife. I sat up, scanning the darkness, trying to see a figure, a shape, a movement. There was nothing, only the forest, endless and silent except for the creek and the wind. I decided to stay awake, keeping the fire alive, scanning with my flashlight, listening intently. That's when I saw it, movement. Just at the edge of the firelight, a shadow slipping between trees. Not an animal. Too deliberate, too careful. I froze, staring, my hands trembling. It didn't make a sound at first. I could see a figure, tall, thin, moving slowly, keeping to the shadows. My heart slammed against my ribs. Panic set in. I considered fleeing to my car, but the thought of running blindly in the dark toward a forest trail I barely knew terrified me more. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it directly at the figure. It froze, just a shadow against the trees, and then it vanished. I could hear a rustle, a snapping of branches further away, moving away from the clearing. But I didn't relax. Whoever it was, they were still nearby. The rest of the night was a blur of fear. Every sound made me jump. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch made my pulse spike. I didn't sleep, didn't dare. When dawn finally came, I felt exhausted but alive. I packed up as quickly as possible, keeping an eye on every movement in the trees. I didn't see the figure again, but I knew it had been there. I made it back to my car without incident, hands sore from gripping my knife, my nerves raw. Back in the safety of my car, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a person camping nearby, moving cautiously through the forest. Maybe it was a hunter or a hiker, but the deliberate way it had moved, the way it had stayed hidden, didn't feel random. I decided to report it to the local ranger station, describing everything I had seen. They were concerned, but didn't have any reports of missing hikers or criminal activity in that area recently. They warned me to be careful and said there were sometimes trespassers or people who liked to watch campers, but that it was rare. Even weeks later, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been following me that night. I kept replaying every sound, every movement, every shadow. But the experience also made me more careful, more aware of my surroundings. The forest isn't just peaceful solitude. It can hide danger not from the animals but from other humans. And sometimes, the scariest part is knowing that danger could be watching you, quiet and patient, waiting for the right moment. I still camp, but never alone in remote areas. I take precautions, stick to more populated trails, and always let someone know exactly where I'm going. That night taught me something vital. Fear is not just a feeling, it's a signal, a warning that your life might depend on paying attention to every detail. And I survived because I listened, because I didn't ignore the signs, because I respected the forest, not just for its beauty, but for its potential to conceal threats. The forest hasn't changed. It's still quiet, still serene, still alive. But I've learned that the real wilderness isn't the wild animals, the rivers, or the trees. It's the unknown humans who move silently through it, unnoticed, waiting, and sometimes it's best to just walk away before curiosity gets you caught. I walked away that night, and that decision saved me. I survived. I carry the memory with me, a reminder that preparation and awareness aren't just about convenience. They are about survival.